2 days after Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine on February 26, 2022, Western governments executed what they believed was the financial equivalent of a nuclear strike. They severed Russia from SWIFT, the global banking communication network processing $5 trillion daily, and simultaneously froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. The expectation was straightforward. Russia's economy would implode within weeks, the ruble would become worthless, and Putin would face either withdrawal or revolution as economic collapse made continuing the war impossible. But 30 months later, Russia's economy didn't collapse. The ruble recovered completely. Russian trade continued through alternative channels, and dozens of countries watching this unfold began constructing their own alternatives to dollar-denominated finance because they realized if America could weaponize the system against Russia, it could weaponize it against anyone. If you want to understand why weaponizing SWIFT and the dollar in 2022 triggered the exact pattern that destroyed British financial dominance between 1914 and 1944, and why that pattern suggests the dollar loses reserve currency status by approximately 2042, subscribe to the Econaut, because we examine the structural forces reshaping global finance that most analysis completely misses. This isn't the first time a dominant power weaponized financial infrastructure. It's happened 4 times across the past century, and every occurrence followed an identical 5-stage pattern, where the dominant power wielding what appears to be ultimate leverage inadvertently destroys the foundation of its own supremacy. Britain controlled global finance in 1914 and weaponized that control by seizing German assets during World War I, then watched neutral countries spend 30 years diversifying away from London until the dollar formally replaced the pound at Bretton Woods in 1944. The United States now controls the dollar SWIFT system and weaponized it against Russia in 2022, and if historical patterns hold, and there's substantial evidence they're already unfolding, America has roughly 20 years before dollar reserve status erodes completely. The timeline might accelerate because modern technology allows alternative payment systems to scale exponentially faster than was possible in the early 20th century, when building parallel financial infrastructure required decades rather than years. SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, isn't a bank, doesn't hold money, and doesn't transfer funds between institutions. SWIFT is a secure messaging network, allowing Bank A in New York to communicate with Bank B in Tokyo when initiating international transactions, transmitting standardized instructions, while actual money moves through correspondent banking relationships. Created in 1973 by 239 banks across 15 countries to replace the slow telex system, SWIFT standardized payment messaging, established security protocols, and made cross-border transactions reliable, growing from 10 million messages annually in 1977 to over 11 billion per year by 2024. SWIFT became the nervous system of global finance. And while it's technically headquartered in Belgium, its board remains dominated by American and European banks. And the United States maintains leverage because most international transactions ultimately settle in dollars through New York correspondent banks. This means Washington can pressure SWIFT to exclude specific countries or institutions. And if you're disconnected from SWIFT, conducting international trade becomes extraordinarily difficult. You're economically isolated. The United States deployed this weapon against Iran in 2012, pressuring SWIFT to disconnect Iranian banks, and the impact was devastating. Iranian oil exports collapsed because buyers couldn't pay. The economy contracted 9%. Inflation hit 45%. The SWIFT weapon appeared to work perfectly, except Iran spent those sanction years constructing alternative payment channels through barter arrangements, cryptocurrency, and non-dollar trade with China, Russia, and Turkey. So when sanctions returned in 2018, Iran survived more effectively. But the 2022 Russia exclusion represented something fundamentally different. This wasn't a small, isolated economy, but the world's 11th largest GDP, a major energy exporter, a nuclear power, and a permanent UN Security Council member being cut off from global finance. Severing Russia from SWIFT was a declaration that the US-controlled financial architecture could exclude any nation for political reasons, regardless of size, and every government worldwide understood the implicit message: cross American foreign policy and lose access to international finance. This created an existential question for every non-Western nation. Do you accept permanent vulnerability to American financial power, or do you invest in building alternatives? Most chose to build alternatives, and that's when the SWIFT weapon began backfiring systematically. The pattern of financial weaponization, backfiring, has repeated 4 times across the past century, with each occurrence following an identical trajectory where the dominant power believes it possesses ultimate leverage while actually accelerating its own decline. Britain during World War I from 1914 to 1918, when the British pound served as the world's reserve currency and the City of London controlled approximately 65% of international reserves. When war commenced in August 1914, Britain passed the Trading with the Enemy Act, allowing seizure of German-owned assets, freezing bank accounts, confiscating businesses, and seizing property in what represented an unprecedented violation of the principle that international finance remained separate from military conflict. The immediate effect devastated Germany, and Britain interpreted this as decisive strategic advantage, except neutral countries watching learned a dangerous lesson. Money held in London wasn't truly safe unless your government maintained British approval. After World War I, neutral nations began systematically diversifying reserves away from London, increasing gold holdings and establishing accounts in New York, Paris, and other financial centers, with the United States benefiting enormously. By 1920, the United States held more gold reserves than Britain. By 1925, New York rivaled London. By 1944, at Bretton Woods, the dollar formally replaced the pound, a 30-year decline from dominance to irrelevance. The United States and Iran in 1979, when Iranian revolutionaries seized American hostages in November, and President Carter responded by freezing all Iranian assets in US banks, approximately $12 billion, representing the largest asset freeze in history at that time. The freeze appeared justified as defending American citizens, but it created unintended consequences worldwide as countries realized that dollar reserves held in US banks could be seized through executive order. In the 1980s, OPEC countries systematically diversified reserves, reducing dollar holdings from approximately 85% in 1977 to roughly 71% by 1991, while increasing Deutsche Mark, yen, and gold holdings. The Iranian freeze worked tactically. Hostages were released in January 1981, but strategically, it taught the world that dollar reserves could be weaponized. So America gained leverage over Iran while losing trust from everyone else. The United States and Russia in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and the US imposed targeted sanctions banning Russian officials from the American financial system. But crucially, Russia wasn't cut off from SWIFT. This proved to be a strategic mistake because it gave Russia 8 years to prepare systematically. From 2014 to 2022, Russia methodically reduced dollar dependency, cutting US Treasury holdings from $130 billion to just $2 billion, increasing gold reserves from 1,000 tons to 2,300 tons, developing SPFS as Russia's domestic SWIFT, and negotiating trade deals allowing payment in rubles, yuan, or rupees. Putin stated explicitly in speeches that Russia was reducing dollar exposure because the US weaponized currency, but Western analysts dismissed this as empty rhetoric, since Russia seemed too integrated into global finance. Russia was serious, and when 2022 sanctions hit, Russia was ready. The 2014 sanctions worked partially, but also provided time and motivation for building alternatives. The United States and Russia in 2022, representing comprehensive financial weaponization, when on February 26th, the US and EU announced major Russian banks would be severed from SWIFT while freezing $300 billion in reserves. This represented the nuclear option, complete financial isolation, and the immediate effect appeared dramatic as the ruble crashed 30% in 2 days, Russian stock markets closed, and Western media declared economic victory. Then Russia stabilized through the central bank hiking interest rates to 20%, demanding European gas buyers pay in rubles, and the ruble recovered all losses within 3 months, while trade continued through non-Western channels. Russia redirected oil exports to China, India, and the Middle East, settled trade in yuan, rupees, and rubles, and by late 2022 the economy had stabilized sufficiently that 2023 GDP grew 3.6%, faster than Germany or the UK. But the real damage wasn't inflicted on Russia. The real damage was inflicted on the dollar and SWIFT, because every country watching understood that the United States would freeze reserves and sever SWIFT access for political reasons. The answer was obvious. The precedent had been established. So these countries did exactly what Britain's competitors did in 1914. They diversified away from dollars and SWIFT while building alternatives, triggering the 5-stage backfire pattern. Stage 1. Dominant power controls the payment system, which from 1973 to 2022 meant the United States effectively controlled SWIFT, because most SWIFT transactions settle in dollars through New York correspondent banks. Stage 2. Weaponize it for foreign policy, which the US did increasingly from 2001 to 2022, initially targeting terrorist financing after 9/11, then expanding to Iran and North Korea, then Russia, with each escalation normalizing financial warfare. Stage 3 targets fine alternatives, which Russia did by expanding SPFS domestically, using China's CIPS for international trade, employing cryptocurrency, and arranging barter deals, so that by 2024, approximately 40% of Russian trade was conducted in non-dollar currencies. Russia-China trade hit $240 billion in 2023, settled almost entirely in yuan and rubles. Russia-India trade occurred largely in rupees, proving you can survive SWIFT exclusion. Stage 4. Neutral countries hedge, representing the critical inflection point where dozens of nations that aren't sanctioned yet fear they might be someday. So they build defensive infrastructure. China accelerated de-dollarization, reducing US Treasury holdings from 1.3 trillion in 2013 to 775 billion by 2024, increasing gold reserves to officially 2,264 tons, but likely over 4,000 unofficially, and expanding CIPS from processing 300 billion in 2021 to over 500 billion by 2024. Saudi Arabia, a US ally for 80 years, saw the reserves freeze and reconsidered. In March 2023, announcing it would accept yuan for oil sales to China, breaking the 50-year petrodollar monopoly, then joining BRICS in December 2024. The UAE began settling India trade in rupees and dirhams. Brazil and Argentina negotiated a common currency, and the expanded BRICS nations, now 9 members including Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, are developing shared payment systems. Even US allies are hedging. The EU developed Instex, Japan and South Korea are increasing yuan reserve holdings, and over 50 central banks are testing alternatives to dollar SWIFT dependence. This diversification isn't driven by anti-American sentiment. It's driven by watching 300 billion frozen through executive order and realizing sovereign reserves aren't truly sovereign if held in dollars. Stage 5. The original weapon loses power, which is where we are currently, as the dollar's share of global reserves fell from 71% in 1999 to 58% in 2024, a 13 percentage point drop. More importantly, the dollar's share of international trade settlement is declining from approximately 73% in 2022 to roughly 58% by 2024, a 15 percentage point drop in just 2 years. SWIFT message volume continues growing in absolute terms, but SWIFT's share is declining as CIPS processed 136 million messages in 2023, up from 91 million in 2022, 50% growth, while SPFS processes about 2 million messages daily, and India's UPI processed 12 billion transactions in 2024. The SWIFT weapon worked tactically by shocking Russia's economy, but strategically it failed because Russia survived and the weapon can never be deployed again with equivalent effectiveness, since targets now expect it. Russian trade data shows that in 2021, before sanctions, 87% settled in dollars or euros, but by 2024, only 60% settles in Western currencies, meaning 40% now uses yuan, rubles, rupees, and dirhams. Russia-China, bilateral trade at 240 billion occurs almost entirely in yuan and rubles. Russia-India trade at 65 billion happens largely in rupees, proving major economies can operate outside the dollar SWIFT system. China's CIPS processed approximately $12 trillion during 2020, but in 2023 processed about 27 trillion, more than doubling in 3 years, and now connects over 400 financial institutions across 110 countries. Central bank gold purchases reached 1,936 tons in 2022, 1,037 tons in 2023, and over 1,000 tons in 2024, 3 consecutive years exceeding 1,000 tons, representing the highest sustained buying since the 1970s. The buyers are China, Russia, Turkey, India, Poland, Singapore, and Czech Republic, countries converting dollar reserves into gold because gold can't be frozen through executive order. Bilateral currency swap agreements have proliferated, with China maintaining swaps with over 40 countries worth approximately 500 billion, allowing trade settlement in local currencies, while Brazil and Argentina are negotiating a common currency, and ASEAN nations are discussing local currency settlement. The petrodollar monopoly that existed for 50 years ended in 2023-2024, as Saudi Arabia accepts yuan from China. Russia sells oil to India in rupees, UAE accepts dirhams and yuan, and Iran sells to China in yuan. BRICS expansion from 5 to 9 members in 2024 created a bloc representing 45% of global population, 36% of global GDP, and 42% of global oil production. At the 2023 Johannesburg Summit, members announced development of a BRICS common currency, backed by a commodity basket including gold, oil, and rare earths. BRICS is constructing an alternative to the dollar system. We can estimate the timeline by examining Britain's historical decline, where weaponizing finance in 1914 led to the dollar replacing the pound at Bretton Woods in 1944, 30 years from weaponization to replacement. Britain also fought 2 world wars that devastated its economy, so financial weaponization alone didn't destroy the pound, but the United States isn't fighting world wars and maintains the world's largest economy. However, modern technology accelerates everything. Building alternative payment systems that took decades in 1914 can now scale exponentially, as CIPS grew from 12 trillion to 27 trillion in 3 years. My estimate based on historical patterns, 15 to 25 years from 2022, placing dollar reserve status collapse somewhere between 2037 and 2047. Not eliminated entirely, but no longer dominant. The dollar's reserve share could fall from 58% today to perhaps 35 to 40% by 2040, still significant but not hegemonic in a multipolar currency world. The trajectory is established as the dollar's reserve share fell 13 percentage points from 1999 to 2024, and at that rate another 13 points reaches 45% by 2049. But the rate is accelerating. If that acceleration continues, we reach 45% by 2035, placing the timeline at 10 to 25 years, not centuries or generations, but 1 or 2 decades. Right now, the United States can run unlimited budget deficits as the world needs dollars for trade and reserves, with foreign countries buying US treasuries, allowing America to borrow $2 trillion annually at low interest rates. But when the dollar's reserve share falls below 40%, this advantage evaporates. Foreign demand for treasuries collapses, US interest rates spike, budget deficits become unsustainable, and America must balance its budget or face high inflation. The American standard of living that depends on importing more than we export and paying with printed dollars becomes unsustainable. This represents the end of the free lunch. China wins massively as the obvious successor to US financial dominance. possessing the second largest economy, the largest manufacturing base, the largest trade volume, and an increasingly important reserve currency. As the dollar declines, the yuan rises proportionally, and China doesn't need to militarily defeat America. China just needs to wait for the dollar to collapse under its own contradictions. Russia wins strategically by proving swift cut-off survival is possible, and this demonstration effect is crucial, as every country that feared US financial power now knows alternatives exist. BRICS nations, including Brazil, India, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, all benefit from a multipolar currency system, providing increased leverage without being trapped in dollar dependence. Gold wins as countries losing trust in fiat currencies buy gold, with central bank purchases at 50-year highs, and alternative payment systems including CIPS, SPFS, UPI, and PIX gain market share. The United States loses hegemony not immediately or catastrophically, but gradually and irreversibly, as the dollar's reserve status is the foundation of American power, allowing unlimited deficit spending, effective sanctions, and living beyond national means. As dollar dominance fades, all these advantages disappear. America must balance its budget. The military becomes unaffordable without unlimited borrowing, and living standards fall relative to the rest of the world. Europe loses alongside the US by tying itself to the dollar system, joining US sanctions against Russia, which aligned Europe with US policy but also tied Europe to dollar decline. The euro could be an alternative to the dollar, but Europe hasn't pursued that aggressively. So as the dollar declines, the euro doesn't automatically rise, the yuan does. SWIFT itself loses relevance as countries diversify away from Western financial systems and reduce SWIFT usage, so SWIFT becomes one of several payment messaging systems instead of the dominant one. Dollar holders lose wealth as anyone holding dollar-denominated assets faces devaluation, not hyperinflation, but persistent 5 to 10% annual inflation as the dollar loses purchasing power. American consumers lose purchasing power as the US imports more than it exports with a trade deficit around $800 billion annually, sustainable only because foreigners accept dollars. When they don't, America must export more or import less, meaning fewer goods, higher prices, and lower living standards. The typical American household faces prices rising 20 to 30% over a decade. The timeline is established. The SWIFT weapon was deployed in 2022, triggering the 5-stage backfire pattern, and we're currently in stage 4 as neutral countries hedge, while stage 5, weapon loses power, is beginning. By 2030, the dollar's reserve share will likely fall to 50%. By 2040, perhaps 40%, with the US maintaining the largest single currency share, but no longer dominance. The SWIFT weapon appeared powerful in February 2022, but financial weapons function like nuclear weapons. You can only deploy them once, and after deployment, everyone builds defenses. Russia built alternatives, China accelerated CIPS, BRICS expanded, the petrodollar broke, and now the SWIFT weapon is useless because anyone the US might target has already constructed alternatives. The United States could have maintained dollar dominance through economic strength, free trade, and rule-based systems, but instead chose financial weaponization, freezing assets, severing SWIFT access, and using the dollar as a coercion tool. This worked tactically against small countries like Iran, but against Russia it backfired systemically because it's not just Russia leaving the dollar system, it's half the world. Britain weaponized finance in 1914 and lost reserve currency by 1944. The US weaponized SWIFT in 2022. And the pattern suggests America loses dollar dominance by 2042, maybe sooner. This isn't prediction, it's pattern recognition, as financial weapons always backfire when the dominant power thinks it's exercising ultimate leverage, while actually teaching the world to build alternatives. The SWIFT weapon destroyed SWIFT's monopoly. The dollar weapon destroyed dollar hegemony. And the country benefiting most is China, the patient rival that watched America destroy its own advantages. America defeated itself by weaponizing the tools of its own dominance, completing the 5-stage pattern, controlled the system, weaponized it, targets found alternatives, neutral countries hedged, and the weapon lost power. This represents the end of dollar hegemony, not with dramatic collapse, but with gradual erosion. Not through military defeat, but through financial suicide. If this analysis revealed a pattern you didn't previously recognize, if you understand that financial weaponization backfires systematically, and the swift cutoff marked the beginning of dollar decline, then you understand the next 20 years of geopolitics. The dollar will decline, the yuan will rise, the world will become multipolar, and the United States will be weaker not because of Chinese aggression, but because of American policy choices. The post-dollar world isn't here yet, but it's approaching on an established timeline with a clear pattern, and the SWIFT weapon was the trigger that historians 20 years from now will identify as the moment American financial dominance ended.